Hi BookTube, I thought I would pop in with my initial thoughts on Man Should Rejoice by Hugh MacLennan. This is a novel that I mentioned in a video a couple of days ago. I mentioned that I had started it, that I had read the introduction, and I also mentioned that this is a previously unpublished novel by the great Canadian author Hugh MacLennan, who won the Governor General's Award in 1945 for his novel Two Solitudes. And his first novel, Barometer Rising, was published just a few short years before Two Solitudes. And prior to that, he hadn't published anything. But there were two novels that he had written and attempted to have published that he essentially gave up on. And one of them was Man Should Rejoice, which he completed in 1937 at a very volatile time historically, just on the eve of World War II, and in the midst of, he wrote it in the midst of the Great Depression and in the midst of the rise of fascism and some complex politics and ideology in North America surrounding communism. And now that I'm about 2/3 of the way through, what I really see is that Hugh MacLennan was almost absorbed with this ideological problem, and it reflects heavily in this novel. This novel is essentially about that tension between a man who wants to be an individual and a man who wants to do good and wants to see people happy. That's sort of how our main character David sees communism. He is the son of a wealthy businessman, extremely wealthy. In fact, he, not long into this novel, inherits $25,000. Now keep in mind, this is 1937, and he just inherited $25,000. Even in today's money, that's quite a bit for an inheritance. You can do a little bit on $25,000, but $25,000 in 1930, I think he's essentially become almost, if not a millionaire overnight. He's quite comfortable. He doesn't really have to work for the rest of his life. He can live fairly well as the artist he wants to be on that $25,000. But his father, Culver, he never refers to his father as dad. He just refers to him as Culver because they've had such a distant and strained relationship. His father, Culver, really sees David as someone who's going to inherit the family business someday. And so he sets out to train him from the bottom up, sending him to work in industry in the plants. But of course, he goes to work just as the Great Depression is starting, just a few short months after the stock markets have crashed. And so because he is the owner's son, his job is secure, but he's watching the men that he works with, he's watching them be fired, he's watching people fall apart. And then, in waltzes his friend Nicholas in the midst of all of this. And Nicholas is his former next door neighbor. Nicholas was an orphan and he was adopted by the wealthy man next door. And they grew up together more or less as their only friends because they were quite isolated. And I should mention this novel takes place in the United States, which is a little bit different for Hugh MacLennan because Hugh MacLennan really published novels set in Canada about Canada. But his first couple of unpublished novels were actually what is described by Colin Hill in the introduction to this critical edition as international novels. They're taking place in the United States, they're taking place in Europe. So David is influenced by Nicholas to join the Communist Party, and you can only imagine the tension that arises between David and his father, who is the business owner, and we have this almost conflict of interest where David is wrestling with what to do. He very much believes himself a communist, but we don't see him rejecting his wealth. Rather, he sees himself as sort of an ally to the worker. But, in the background of all that, we have his desire to be a painter. But he's got this notion, after spending some time in Europe, after spending some time in Paris, that he can't start out painting right away. He has to do what his father has asked and go to work and learn the business, not because he's interested in the business, but because he needs to live a bit before he will be properly inspired and properly informed to paint what he is meant to paint. And so we have this very dreamy figure living this life of privilege who is caught up in politics. Now, this sounds like a fine premise for a novel, and it is, it's very much a structure that I recognize from Hugh MacLennan's other novels. There's always that sort of ideological or political aspect that often emerges in his novels. There is the tension in what to do with your life. A lot of the time, our protagonists in his novels have that artistic bent. They want to be that painter, or more often they want to be that writer. And we also have that relationship conflict. Unfortunately, we also have what I've learned to reflect on as MacLennan's flat female characters. As Colin Hill rightly says in the introduction, all the women in this novel are two-dimensional, they're flat. In fact, they almost all seem the same. They are shadows of what a woman would be in real life, and I think that's something that even Hugh MacLennan recognized, that he couldn't really write women properly. He never learned to write women. Every single woman in his novels essentially seems to be a reflection of his first wife. I believe her name was Dorothy. She is reflected in all his novels, in all the female characters. At least that's my thoughts, that's my opinion, because they all seem to be the same, and they all seem to embody things that I've read about Dorothy embodying, his wife Dorothy. But that aside, so it's a fine premise in itself, but you can really tell that it was an early novel of his. This is not a novel that was ever published, and it shouldn't have been published. Now, I think it's fine. In fact, I'm pleased that it's coming to us now in this critical edition. Almost, about 80 years? Yeah, about 80 years after the fact, I'm pleased that it's coming to us in this critical edition. But you can tell just in the writing, in the structure, in the characters, that this is not something that was good enough to be published. It was it was rejected by the publishers with good reason. It's that style of writing where you can tell that the author is trying too hard. The author has a ideological or political or philosophical point about life to make, and God damn it, he is going to hammer it in. He is going to explicitly spell it out in dialogue throughout the novel. And that is essentially what we're getting here. We have those out and out conversations about the Depression, about art, about life, about communism. But that's not to say that it's a completely horrible novel. There are a few passages where I'm reading and I say to myself, this sounds like the Hugh MacLennan that I've learned to love through his later published novels. And for me, in this early section of the novel, page 58 and 59, this is where I really said to myself, this sounds like Hugh MacLennan's style. This is him describing a landscape, describing what it means to live in that landscape. Now, it's a very literary, very descriptive, very flowery description, but flowery in a good way, flowery style of writing. but it's something that I think he does well. And so maybe I'll just read a bit to you here. So this is a section where David is seeing the province of Nova Scotia. And this is where I think the novel finally seems to begin to come into its own. But it only lasts for a short section, and then it really slips. And I won't talk about that slip next. Now I'll save that slip for another video, perhaps in my Friday reads. I'll wrap up my thoughts on this. But it does slip, and you can see that he really lost control of the story he was telling. But this section here is really nice. The floor of the ocean swung against the continent, thousands of miles of water heavy with salt, and there were no people. Here on the rocks a man could find peace. The great glacier had scraped them, and they stood bare and enormous on the edge of North America. I looked at their color and form and felt my mind being cleansed. For the heat went out of it, and instead of wanting to defend myself by hating people, I felt suddenly humble. These ancient bones of the earth had not altered since man first lifted his forearms and learned to walk. I looked at them and ceased to feel mean. 6,000 years of history, and we had conquered this heavy immobility. Why couldn't even my father look at what man had done and take a God's eye view? No one could identify these formations with his personal emotions or sense of human analogy in the ponderous fluid forms that pressed against them. Smooth surges of water bulged against the granite, their color that of gray daylight, and with sinuous, intricate balance they swung inward, and among them the granite stood like oh goodness, I forgot that word was in there. I forgot to look that one up. And antediluvian monsters. Some, where the water washed, were sleek and smaller like sea-dwelling mammals, but the quartz glittering in the most massive forms, and the backs of these had the hard, scaly gloss of a dry snake. And he goes on to describe this island and the lighthouse keeper's cottage, where he is spending some time and where there is a 70-year-old lighthouse keeper. And then he says something that I think is quintessential of the idea of Eastern Canada. He says, if all of Western civilization collapsed overnight, this section of North America could continue unchanged, because the women would merely bring up their looms from the cellars and weave their own cloth. All other necessities, food and boat and tackle, the men provided even now. So that's just it puts an interesting image in my mind of, this Great Depression, this thought that perhaps, not only the economy, but civilization itself might be on the verge of collapse. And David, our protagonist, finds himself in Nova Scotia and finds himself looking at this civilization, at this way of life, and thinking, if everything collapsed, perhaps in this corner of the world, things would be okay. They would get on, they would survive. And so Nova Scotia for him, throughout this novel, seems to be a hopeful place, a place where he can be free, where he can be alone, where he can connect with human beings. And it's interesting because his mother felt a similar way about Nova Scotia. His mother was Russian, and there's the story that his father was over in Europe, met her, and brought her back. And although they were in love at first, they had a very tense relationship. But she had spent so long on this sea voyage that when she first saw land on the boat after all this time, it was a relief. And Nova Scotia, Canada, was the first stop that the boat made. It was the first sight of land that she saw. And so, to her dying day, it held a special place in her heart. And in the hustle and the bustle of the big American cities, she had in the back of her mind this first sight of land that she had seen in North America, this peaceful, welcoming place that she wanted to return to. And so, that's also interesting. that even when Hugh MacLennan is trying to write the international novel, write about the American experience, that love of the Canadian landscape sneaks back in a very beautiful way, I think. So I'm looking forward to finishing this one, and I'll check back in, I guess, on Friday when I will hopefully have finished that to let you know my final thoughts on that novel. I hope you all have a great evening, and here I am. I've been holding my glass of wine once again and not drinking it. Last time I did that, in the comments below, it was kind of funny. A bunch of you were commenting on my wine, and I guess I was shifting my hand back and forth, and you were all concerned I was going to spill it. But, I pour this to drink, but I think I also pour it in part, as a prop to have something to hold on to. But I do intend to actually drink it this time. There we go.